So up to this point, we've got the row by row being created. We need to basically now put this stray piece of code in the right place. The function that makes the table appear is basically complete. Right? We have this function that its purpose is to show the comics in a table, and then ultimately, after we have our algorithm, our little loop, it writes that string, that data, as HTML into our waiting div. So this is done. It's building the row at a time. The trick is, okay, this needs to be put into the right place, and more than one place. This is preparing to show the comics. So there are a few instances where we want this to happen. First of all, let's comment it out. I'll probably delete it completely because it's just in the wrong place. It was there as a testing purpose. We want to save a comic and then go look at our handiwork. We want to save a comic and see that, yep, there's our comics. So we're going to add this function after the moment we save a comic. Let's go find our save comic function. Fn save comic. So do you see the logic of that? We're going to put something into the database. We're going to save to the database. And then I want to see the result. Well, the Fn prep comic is the process to start to display it on screen. We've got our save comic, etc., etc., etc. Put it. If we get an error, deal with that, etc. Or else there's no error. So anywhere within this else that we add that code should refresh that table. So let's add it, I guess, just right after success OK. Fn, what do we call it again? Prep comic. Show. There we go. Yes, view comic prep. Fn view comic prep. It's a function. We call the function. After saving a comic, display them, or display it. So this is the function that starts the process to get the data from the database, which then passes it on to the function to write the table. We see it on screen. Okay, that's one place. When we save a brand new comic, if we log into our app or have it auto log in, those are a couple of other places where we need it. If we previously created an account and we're still logged in, show me the comics of the account that I've logged in with. So what function is the one that remembers, or where in our code does it remember that you've logged in? The auto login part. Anyone remember that? Should be somewhere near the top. Let's see, after our variables. initdb. The purpose of initdb is to initialize the database. So close. Right over here, the check who is logged in. We didn't put it in any separate function. It just happens right away near the top of our code. So this is the other part. Check, is anyone logged in? No one's logged in? Or keep them outside of the app. Someone's logged in? Okay, move them into the inside of the app. But before we move them into the inside of the app, to do display or not any comics particular user already has, say, oh, we made ourselves a note. Good. So under that to do, fn view comics prep user detected, so load create their database, and display their comics. Show their email at bottom if you want. Okay, so before we move them over from PG welcome, prep that screen, then move them to PG home. There's the use case scenario that they logged out because someone else wants to log in to see their comics. So where in our code do we have it set up to detect that a new person has gotten into our app? Manually. This is the automatic way. Where's the manual way to get into our app? After login, fn login. Okay, so the third place is when a person manually logs in. So when a person logs in, let's see here. What's that?
We have to do a note.
We have to do what? Sorry.
To do a note as in the last class.
In the one more note that we have, yes. Good. We're pretty smart. We give ourselves notes. So there we go. Check if they exist. Blah blah blah. The user does exist. Okay. Before we move them to the other screen, let's update their list of comics. Remember, we have it built in that if they don't have any comics, we had it say a message, so it won't just be kind of an empty screen. And if you want to get advanced, instead of making it just say a message, you can have a graphic appear or anything else. That all comes from that prep comic. And here, and show their comics. Those should be, so far, the 3 places. Oh, actually, one more place, if we think about it. Where? When we delete the whole collection, exactly. As we were beta testing it, if we stopped at this point to test it, it would work, and then as you beta test it more, hopefully you tested, what about if I delete my collection? Well, internally, it deletes it internally, db.destroy, the end. But visually, the interface doesn't change until we make it change, and we probably made a note for that as well. So once we delete the collection, that's another place where we need to refresh that screen. It's not refreshing the whole screen, it's refreshing the div, but that's the idea. Let's go find fn delete collection. To do, refresh the view comics screen. There we go. Now the order of this definitely matters, because if we tried to, in this case, if we tried to display comics from a database that doesn't exist first, that would break. So obviously we don't refresh the comics and then open the database. So we put that in the specific order. fn view comics.
So all that does is view comics where there's no comics. But it refreshes it and then it shows that there's no comics.
Exactly. It shows a message. We deleted the database, and then it shows it refreshes that screen, because if we didn't have that, it would still show a table full of comics. But we have set up in our algorithm that it displays a message when there's no comics. And that could instead display a graphic or any other thing, or play a sound or anything else. Okay, we can test it at this point to see if all of that works. So see now, even if there's absolutely no account and no comics, this is where we didn't end that one other lecture. We didn't have the function complete, and we didn't have this function in the right place. We just had it as a testing the other time, and now it's in the right place multiple times. Just confirm that the other examples don't exist, because outside, right, I had that one outside of a function. Make sure that's deleted or commented out. I will delete it. And I think there might have been another stray one that we had as we were testing it. I think I had another one before. As we were testing it after View Comics Prep, there was a test one, and then Comics Table. So if you still have one more floating around right there, make sure that's commented or deleted, as well as the one after the table. And then try it, save it, and run it, and now it should be fully functional in terms of I save a comic, I view a comic. I save 3 comics, I view a comic. I won't have to refresh anymore. This was the sort of refreshing for you internally in the app. You don't have to shut down the app and rerun it. You don't have to press the refresh on the browser. Well, eventually, when it's on a real device, there's no refresh here. I don't want to quit the app and start it again. We have the refresh of the table now built into the app. Or so I'll see. So I'm about to do that. I'm about to save a comic. Comic saved. I just saved a comic number 55. I go here to view. I have comic 55. I'm going to save a brand new comic. 300. Number 1. I think 1998 or so. Image. Frank Miller. Before the movie. Save that. View. There's the comic I just saved. There's a comic called What the? Exclamation point. That. From like 1978 or so. This is the part still about those special symbols and all of that, but there we go. So I'm saving brand new comics. The table is dynamically growing as I add more data to it. Here's another test of that. What about if I delete the collection? Delete collection. Clicking OK on that. Collection deleted. Close the window. No comics. So obviously this is not automatic. We're programming it step by step. One more test. I can't assume it fully works. Things could go wrong. I'm going to save another comic. The Amazing Spider-Man. Number 1. Okay, I get the save. If I get an error there, something to fix. Better yet, if I view, there's the comic. So as you test this, you might see some interesting things happen. So if I save a comic, something very simple, and then I save another one a little bit more complex, when I wrote the name of a comic that was very long, did you see that the table grew to the size of the screen? When I write a short named comic, the table's kind of puny. So again, Amazing Spider-Man. See that? That's not professional in terms of the table sometimes is a certain size and other times another size. I want consistency. But the default behavior of a table is that it grows and shrinks depending what's inside of it. I want to change a couple of things about my table before we get too complex. I don't want to have like the big old word number to explain that this is the number of the comic. How else might I delineate that this column stores or displays the number of a comic? The hashtag or some other sort of short symbol. So I'm going to change that. And do we really need for there to be the word more in this column? People probably will understand, depending on the icon, that I can click that to view more. So I want to change this now that I've kind of tested it a little bit. I don't really want it to say the word number. I want the symbol. And I don't need the word more in there anymore. So let's change our table. This table is dynamically generated in JavaScript, so we're editing this in JavaScript, of course. View comics table function. We've got the function in charge of displaying the table. And here it is, our very first row, which has the table headings of name, number, and more. Okay, number symbol will be good enough. I don't want anything visible inside of the table heading really, but a quirk that sometimes happens of an empty table cell is that the cell collapses and looks weird unless there's actually data inside of it. So I want to put an empty space here, but the space like that doesn't cut it. Anyone know or remember what is the way to force an empty space in HTML? Perfect, ampersand, NBSP, semicolon. Non-breaking space, NBSP. That creates an empty space. If I just put a space, probably it will be ignored, but if I put the code for a space, it should obey there to be a space. And that's just so that this cell doesn't sort of collapse or look empty or look, the edges are missing. Sometimes weird stuff happens if there's nothing in a cell. And then the number symbol.
So we put CSS on this table.
Yeah, exactly.
So we put an ID on it.
We will CSSify it, yes, and we could do it a couple of ways by putting an ID. What I like to do is, okay, that was off the top of your head, very good, you remembered that. Let's do it a slightly different way, because I like to give kind of different ways to do things, and then you might figure out this is a slightly different way that might work for these other purposes versus this. So yes, we could put an ID here. Let me show you another way to do it just because of the complexity of CSS. Let's take a little segue to do a little bit of CSS styling of this table. First of all, I don't want to put the attribute of border. I want to control all of this via CSS. The right language for the right task. Border 1 is a good stopgap measure, but not the best one. So let's take away border for the moment. And we're going to style this via CSS. We have several ways to target this. The easy way is to give it an ID. Let's do it the less easy way, because it builds character. Yes. Okay, so let's go over to our CSS file. Let's work with CSS in the CSS file. Index CSS. Let's go to the end of our code. Make a quick note here. Style the table. Style the dynamic table that displays our comics. So if I start with table, this selector would try to select or target any instances of any table. And right now we've got one table, which might be good enough. But what if I want to display different tables throughout my whole app? I don't want all of them to look the same. So we need to be a little bit more specific in our CSS here. We didn't put an ID, like table comics or anything. We didn't put an ID in this table. So we're not going to go that route. But that table is inside of another element. We have to remind ourselves of what that is in the HTML file. Let's go look at the HTML file to see that table that we want to style is inside of some element. What's that? In the index HTML file, in the view page, yes, exactly. So in the view page of the HTML file, we need to see which specific element this table is inside of. So let's find view page. Here we go, the view page. In the PG View Comics screen, we have right here. Comics go here. A table will dynamically be written inside of this div. And look at that. That has a unique identifier that we set up already. So we want to target the table inside of this div. We want to select the table inside of that div. That div, first of all, is called pound div view comics. Space. There is a table inside of it. Background color. This is where you can pick whatever colors you want. I'm just going to randomly pick some colors. Aquamarine, sure. Style the dynamic table that displays our comics. So this table doesn't exist until after we've saved at least one comic, or created an account at least. And here our selector is saying, go search for something with a certain ID of div view comics, and in space we have a child of that table. Change the background color. This would be equivalent if I had named my table with a unique ID, table 01. If we did it this way versus this way, which is better? What's that?
The view comic way?
Why?
Because it's easier to read.
You both have a good point there. It's a trick question. They're both good. They're both bad. This is easier to read. I can see there is a table in a certain div. That makes sense to me. Or if I had named the table something meaningful, table of comics, they both eventually get to the same result. So with such a simple sort of table that we're trying to style, either or will work. This is where you can decide which one you like. But as we get maybe complex about what about a cell inside of a certain table, and we've got 3 tables, and they're all dynamically generated, we might have to create a CSS rule that is very specific. Let's do a little bit more with this table. Let's say div view comics table headings. Background color. There's a color here called Rebecca Purple. You can pick any colors you want, but I'm going with these colors. So here I'm saying search for a certain element with an ID. Inside of it is a table. Inside of it is at least one heading. Now this is a little superfluous, but let me add this. What happens when I add this particular part here? What am I saying now? What's happening before the pound sign? What do you think that means?
Can you include the entire section?
There's a what?
A div tag directly in front of it.
It has to be green. If you change black, the color will no more.
That's right, it has to be applied. We're applying it, we're selecting a div and not an article. So here I'm just being even more specific, which might be superfluous. What I'm saying is, what I'm selecting is, it has to be a div element that has an ID of whatever. Inside of it there's a table, and inside of it there's a heading. So maybe that's a little bit extra to also make you, to make it make sense. It'll work fine without it. But sometimes you have to say that because you might have more than one element. You know, even with it might be more obvious with a class. We might have more than one div, more than one table or whatever. But something is in a div and something is in an H1. So what I'm getting at is that we can say what type to what element is the ID or class attached to. And I'm going to put it in just for to be super obvious. There is a div with an ID of this, and we style it thus. Let's take a quick look at it then, run it. Let's see what we get. Remember to save all. We're working with a couple different documents now, so save all. Run it just to see what that's looking like. Okay, so color combinations I'll work on. They look a little weird, but I'm starting to target this stuff. I sure miss those borders around each particular cell, and eventually also I want to style it so that it takes up a good amount of space, or maybe center it or whatever. But we're on the right track. It's no longer the plain table anymore. I'm starting to style it with the right selectors. So if I go back to the code, okay, so to the table itself I want to do a few things. I want to automatically center it. So another property here, and there's several ways to do centering. Anyone remember or perhaps know what is one possible way to center?
Marginato.
Marginato is one of the cleanest ways, but other ways that we can do it, we'll also do it. Text-align or align? There's usually an align attached to something like a text-align. If we just do align, might not do exactly what you think. If we do text-align would align the text inside of the table, but not the whole table itself. And as this pops up here, it also seems to give a little bit of pop-up here. Describe how inline content of a block horizontally. Yeah. So Marginato is one of the ways to automatically put an equal amount of space on the edges of the object, of the element table. I'm also going to do a width of Let's do 95%, and then we'll play with these values. If my app could go landscape, remember we locked it to portrait, do we want it to stretch all the way to 75%, 95, 100%, or whatever? We've got it locked to portrait, so our size here isn't as wide as landscape. And we can set minimum and maximum widths and all of that as we test it. But here I'm going to say, don't stretch out the table completely all the way to the edges. Center the table, margin auto. Put a background color. And then I want to put edges around the element. How do we deal with putting edges around an element? Heading? Padding. Oh, I want a visual edge around elements. Border. So how does this one work? It pops up to tell you. A border is made out of a size, a type, and a color. Just to pick some values, 5 pixel dashed pink. I'm going to pick better graphically designed colors and style soon enough, but just to see something. So a 5 pixel dashed pink border, sure. Now this is the part where I can save it and run it, and then in the simulator, or on a real device, using the developer tools in the browser, I can play with colors and such. I can, remember, open up F12. I can go to the element inspector and then click on a particular element and maybe play with some of these values on the side in my table.
You set these up with if you put in jQuery attributes, it would just automatically call in the rest of your jQuery, right? jQuery has
jQuery or jQuery mobile?
jQuery mobile.
One of the differences there, however, is that this is dynamically generated. So this table doesn't even exist at runtime.
So jQuery mobile wouldn't pick it up correctly.
Yeah, sometimes I see that if it's not there at runtime, jQuery mobile doesn't kick in just right to it. Okay, so let's do some more CSS on this. The put something a little bit more readable, actually. Okay, so technically what we did here was we put a border around the whole table. Did you see that this was around the outside of the table? We targeted the table itself, and what it did was around the whole outside of the table. But a table, what's inside of a table? What elements are in a table? Rows and columns, specifically cells, TD. So I want to also put this black border on my TDs, on my cells. So this is where we can create our selector to be very unique. Let's do it this way. We can play with this. Let's say a new selector out here. So I'm going to copy this first one. And then space TD. We'll see why in a moment. Border 2-pixel solid red. Okay, so this is again saying there is a div with a certain ID, and inside of it has a table, and inside of the table are cells, which are going to have a border of 2-pixel solid red. So if I check that out, it's doing what I said. There's these cells that have a solid red 2-pixel border. There's the one I did on the outside. I changed it. And looks pretty cool. Why doesn't this first row have red borders? It's a heading, TH. It's not a TD. It's not a regular cell. Regular cell is TD. The top first row is a TH, a table heading. So I've got 3 different rules, 3 different selectors. I could consolidate them somewhat. I could separate them for the logic of it. But let's try it this way. Let's say that, okay, here I'm targeting a cell, a regular cell, and here I'm targeting a heading. How could I possibly consolidate this? Can I consolidate it? Border?
You mean remove border between header and
I do want a border. I do want this red border around everything. Right now, the red border is only around regular cells, but I also want a red border on headings. Is there a way for me to write some code that is a little more concise than both separately?
You just add T comma
Comma TD?
no comma.
Yes, comma, because we want to select this, comma, and this, so definitely a comma. But that TD is not specific enough. That's going to say anywhere where there's a cell, even in the wrong table. Have to put the whole preamble part of it. Now that's making all of the backgrounds of the cells purple, not just the headings. So,
Make it down there, maybe the one border is closed.
so maybe do it the opposite way. Maybe make a rule that only deals with borders, and make a rule here that's dealing with headers only. So this is on the wrong track, but it's on the right. It's good to show you that what makes sense, okay, let's just combine it. But wait a minute, combining it will combine it literally everything. Everything's going to get that purple color. This is the part again about the CSS, about sort of like the interconnectivity of it. So, okay, it's not the right track to do it like this, so take that back, don't forget the comma. We have a rule that will say headings are Rebecca purple, and then over here, then I also want that. In either order that you want, shouldn't matter. But I'm saying, look for a div with a certain ID, inside of it is a table, inside of it is a cell, and look for a div with a certain ID, inside of it is a table and a heading. Give me the border around them both. So the important part is that comma. We can create a list here, selecting multiple things at once. In my case, that color of the background of those headings is nice, but now the text is hard to read. So what's my property to change my color of text? Color These other cells just inherit the color from before, which is black. So depending if you picked a dark background color, you might pick a light foreground color. Okay, so here's some kind of esoteric things. Let's go back to table, and we will add, you might not see the example of it right now, but as we beta test this more, this will come up. If there's a name of a comic that is bigger than the size of your screen, it may pop out of the table in a weird way. So we have word wrap that we can apply. And we have a property over here of word wrap. We have various possibilities. Break it and put a dash to hyphenate it. Normal, which is the default. Break word. An unbreakable word may be broken at any arbitrary point. So has anyone tried to save any comics with a really, really, really long name and see what happens? If you haven't, from previous semesters, if you try to save a really long comic name, it might pop out of the box. If we do a word wrap of break word, it will then automatically break the word when it gets to the edge of the table instead of popping out of the table. So say word wrap. Oops, this is a different comment here. Let's say word wrap. So text doesn't pop out of cells. If I view my result as I test this, okay, it's coming together. I'll pick better colors later, but now I'm seeing the results. This is nice and readable here, nice color there, borders and so forth. I'm going to save a few more comics. In order for this to look nice, make sure you have a few amount of comics here. I want to deal with zebra striping. I want to do this. As we get more and more comics, they get a little bit jumbled together. We can do this trick of zebra striping in terms of alternating colors. That one particular row will be one color, another will be another color, and then another, back and forth. And that's a good way to make readability. So we can create CSS for that. Okay, so we'll make a note. We'll say style the even rows of the table, because we will then eventually have style the odd rows. I want to style the rows of a particular table. Help me out with that starting point, then I'll show you the new part. How do I start to target rows of a particular table? Div. Table. TR. Comics. Space. Table. Space TR. Yes. Spaces are important. So we assume spaces, but we shouldn't. So, okay. okay, yeah. This is targeting all rows of this table. So here, what's that? There is a way to do evens and odds, exactly. There is a way to then specify, do we deal with odds, do we deal with even rows? When we do that, colon. Semicolon ends the statement. Okay. NTH dash of dash type parentheses. So this is a very unique and a special way to, this is a pseudo selector. It lets you select things not in a very obvious way. It's almost like an expression, like a function in the most modern aspects of CSS. If we were using, CSS 1.0 or 2.0, this might not be compatible, but we've got more modern devices and such, so this is compatible. So nth of type. So basically then we say here even. So this expression is basically giving me the even type of rows. So if we're going to do this for odd, I'm going to copy that and just change one thing, odd. Now when I was writing it, let me see if I can get the pop-up to pop up, I guess not. But when I was writing it here, it kind of popped up to give some other examples, didn't it? Nth of type right there. So we can do really complex things in terms of what are some like mathematical ways to select columns or give me the last column. So there's like in the most modern versions of CSS, there's some pretty advanced selectors so that I dynamically keep making more columns, so I always want the last column to be styled a certain way that has a pseudo-selector built in. So, okay, we're going to do odd. And it's simply just changing the background color, but with a cool little trick. In RGB, just randomly picking some colors here. Whatever color that is. Here's the trick. If I want one row, one color, and then the alternate row, another color, and then back and forth, the colors should be cohesive, they should match. If I start with this base color, let's say it's purple, and I want sort of like a shade of purple. Do you know possibly how I might be able to get a shade of that same color? Or a variation of that same color? What is A? Opacity or alpha, yes. If we do RGBA on the second one, now we can affect the opacity. RGB is the solid version of the color. RGBA with alpha for opacity. If we add a fourth value, like 0.5, well, it's the same color as before, but now it's half as strong. This is one way to keep the consistency of color, but just a different shade of it, a more transparent version of it. RGBA. So we have a fourth value there, which is from 0 to 1. 0.25 is 1/4 visible. 0.75 is 3/4 visible. 0.5 is half visible. 0.01, 1% visible. Question?
What if you're using hex?
Hex is not built to do just that exactly.
You just have to get the RGB equivalent of what you're using.
I believe so. Yeah, because the hex is defined as it's this color with our 6 values. Maybe we can put it in maybe opacity. However that one is. I usually don't use that one, so I have to look it up. But I think we can do another opacity, a separate opacity of an element's text where 1 is opaque, 0 is entirely transparent. So there's probably a way to do hex as well, but off the top of my head, I'm not sure. So we just have to look it up.
There is, it's usually filter opacity.
So it's filter : opacity.
And then it's like a percentage.
Filter opacity, and then what is that? Equals or colon or what?
You can just put in parentheses like 0.5, for example.
Oh yeah, there it is. Filter opacity, whatever. Okay. 0.5. Try that. There's different ways to do it. Okay, we'll do one more thing while we're here in the CSS. Let me just run it to confirm that works. There you go. Those colors are terrible, but I'll make better colors later. And then that text color, probably want it white or some light color. I'll fix that. But okay, this table's coming together. These icons, I want to make those icons larger or smaller. If I wanted to make those icons larger or smaller, I can do so with CSS. So these particular icons, I want to make them larger or smaller. Resize the icon. Resize the view more icon. So first we need the selector. We need the rule that targets the icon. So it starts off again. There's a div that has a unique ID. There's a table inside of that. How do I target the icon? It's in a particular cell.
We have a class.
We could do last column, but let's try this other way first. How are we saying here?
How we specify a class.
We specified a class. Okay, so what might come next? Yes, we specified a class already. Now, what if we so last column might work, but what if we didn't have the those icons in the last column? So we're doing it this way. We had a class. So what's the next bit of code here, perhaps? Show comic, whatever we called it, I'll fix that. But that's in a cell, right? So we should also say that there is a class dot attached to a cell with whatever the name of that was. Where is that name again? Show comics info. This is where I'll use text-align center because the icon is in a cell. It's an icon, but it's text-based. It's a particular, glyph in a font. And so I'm saying align that little piece of text in the cell, so text-align center. And then the size of it, since it's text, I'm going with font size. And we'll play with this size a little better later, but I'll go with 125%. So make it slightly larger than the default font size. Actually, let's make it obvious so that you remember to change it. So when I grade you and I say, why is your icon huge? Let's do 225 at the moment. Go ahead and save it and run it, and let's see. This should make that icon a lot larger. But the point of this is to say, there's an icon, several icons with a certain class. And they are in a cell, which is inside of a table, which has been uniquely identified inside of a div. Let's see. There it is. So it's clearly 225% larger. It's too big, but it's obviously there. This is part of the creativity of you choosing the readability of all of this, colors and such. Maybe I don't want that aqua color anymore there. It looks a little too bright. And it's a little hard to read this text. I need to change that. So there's a lot of styling onto this. We can still do more, but I think for the moment we'll wind down at this point where we're finally starting to see the fruits of our labor in terms of we've been able to save data to the database. We can start to view the data. It is dynamic in terms of as we save more comic data, it adds it to the database and retrieves it. And it properly organizes it. There's 007 before 1. These will be clickable by next time. And it's coming together. So on this last CSS stuff, any questions that make sense? This is all about styling it, and I didn't want to leave the table to be very, very plain at this point now that we're starting to add content to it. There's a lot of tricks that we can do to further style it, but this is a good starting point. So, questions on the CSS? Questions on any of the JavaScript we looked at today? So that algorithm right there, we spent a lot of time on and to figure out the logic of it, and then displaying it properly at the right time. I'm going to go ahead and completely delete that temporary thing. It's not really worth it at all that I have that anymore. If I
Explain one more time, why do you do big ID instead of just ID?
right up here.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is to show that we're using the right attribute for the task in terms of I want to store a particular, because it's named the same thing. Like, let's imagine that we wanted to store the title of our data from the database. I'm equating that there is title data in this cell. So I'm naming it as data title. If I wanted to store the publisher of the comic in the database, I'm calling it data publisher. It just so happens that underscore ID in the database looks like ID of a CSS or JavaScript.
But why you need to use data?
When we, later on when we click the View More Comics, I want to read what's in this attribute, And I might have instances later where I do call it data publisher, where I have to call it data publisher, data notes. So I'm going to show later when we retrieve it, how do we retrieve data from something inside of a data dash something.
So is this because it's part of the college database that you're doing this?
Partly in terms of I want to call, if this were notes, you know, I want it to be called logically data notes. And for me to read what's in that is not the same as if I was just using plain old JavaScript ID.
So you did it for possibilities.
I did it for the possibilities that we could have, depending how we make our app. It makes a lot of sense that if it was just ID, but I want to show that if we can't use ID and we have to make up our own data dash something, when we get to that, I want to see, well, how do we access the data inside of data dash something?
I got a quick question that's stemmed off of that.
Yes.
So it says data dash ID. But before we were doing data dash role, is that the same reference to data, or is that word data referring to the parameter that's passed into the function?
Data dash whatever is an independent attribute. It's not tied to jQuery mobile or anything. It's part of the HTML5 specification. So they say you can make data dash whatever you want. jQuery mobile team said we're going to use data role. And when we set that equal to page, our further code will know to do something with that particular data. Okay, good. Any other questions on our code for the day? Okay, we're going to do some lab time, and I'll put the code there, and make sure you enrolled and signed in, and when we come back on Thursday, we will do the next part of it. I'm going to click View More, and that will do something.